Hi everybody, welcome to Bike Revs. I'm Mark. Now, last time around we looked at the front suspension on this Z900 and I tried to dial it in as best as I could. So first of all, we had a look at the sag and the preload, and I've set it so that the sag's at about 30 to 35 mil, and that's just right. And I've been testing it with the zip tie that I've got around that front fork, just seeing where the suspension comes to when I'm out on a ride, and it is bang on. Now, the second thing we looked at was the rebound, or the dampening, and we'll come on to talk about a lot more about that later. But the default setting on the forks on these is 6 clicks from fully clockwise, but actually it felt a little bit dead and the bike wasn't really springing back after it went over a bump. So I turned it from 6 clicks to 15. Now, let's be honest, that was a little bit optimistic, and actually, really, if there's one thing I've learned from that last video is that you should do things maybe 1 or 2 clicks at a time, because actually on the drive it was absolutely fine and it felt good when I was just sort of bouncing it around like this. But out on a ride, out with my mates on the weekend, and you know, hitting corners quite quickly, some of them a little bit bumpy, and I was finding that the front end was bouncing like this, so there wasn't enough dampening, so I well overcooked that. So as I suspected from the last video, I did have to make a few final adjustments after I'd filmed that video, just once I got the bike really out on the road and I tested it a bit more. And so for me, at 13.5 stone, fully laden, that's about 190 pounds and 5'7", if that matters. What I've done is I've taken the preload and I've backed it off by 2 turns. So that's now 9 turns from fully anti-clockwise instead of 11 turns. And this one, the screw there, which is normally 6 turns from fully clockwise, is now 10 turns from fully clockwise, which has given me a little bit more rebound, a little bit less dampening, which I find is a much comfier ride. So that's what I've done. That's not going to be the same for everyone, and actually if I was going out riding really hard on a track or something like that, I'd definitely dial this dampening in a little bit more and turn it clockwise a few turns. But essentially I've got the front end of a sports bike now and the back end of a cruiser, so I need to do something about this back end, and I think this is going to be an altogether more difficult task. Right then, to show you exactly what I mean, I've wheeled out my wife's 125 to do a comparison. Now I realise they're very different bikes. I mean, they're both street machines, but this clearly is a lot bigger than that one. However, just look at this for 1 second. The rear on this, if I put some pressure onto it, it really is quite springy and bouncy, and not particularly lively either. So you can see how much give there is in that. If on the other hand I compare that to my little 125, there is very little, and it's quite hard to press down. Now admittedly this is quite a hard ride on this bike, but it goes around corners beautifully. So I think I need to be a bit more like this. I'm not quite so much like that, but perhaps not as extreme as this one. That could probably do with backing off a little bit. Now, I've read a lot of information on forums, and people have been sending me loads of good stuff about the bikes and setting up the suspension, and one of the things that keeps coming up is the fact that the rear spring on this is quite soft. So whilst you might say it's too soft, actually it's probably about right for the market where this sells the most, and that market isn't necessarily the burger eating west of England. So even then, I'm only 5'7", so I'm not really massively heavy. I'm 13.5 stone, fully laden, as I say. So I should be able to make the most of that spring, but I'm definitely, I think, going to have to add some preload. We'll find out in a minute when we measure it all up. But yeah, so the spring is famously quite soft on these. Well, we can see that, can't we? So let's see what I can do with it. Right then, what I need to do now is exactly what I did at the front, which is to measure my sag. Now, it was easy on the front because I could use zip ties and measure things on the forks, but on the back it's much more difficult, because what I need to do is extend the bike so the suspension's at its fullest, and then measure between 2 points, then sit on the bike and measure it again and take a difference. But it's really difficult to do those measurements when you're sat on the bike. So what I've done is devised a plan. And I've got this, which is a piece of wood with a hole drilled in the end. I'm going to put a bolt through it, and then I've got a spacer. I've no idea what that is. I found it knocking about in the garage, but that will be used as a spacer, and then I can put this piece of wood into where my bobbin normally goes at the back for my paddock stand, and I can use that then as a fixed measuring point against the bike. Well, that's the plan anyway. I should be able to do that on my own without having to get my wife to come out every 5 minutes with the tape measure. So let's get that onto the bike. Now, I don't know what you guys think of that, but I reckon I could patent that design. So as I say, all I'm going to do now is get myself a Sharpie so I can make some marks on this piece of wood, and also put a piece of tape on there so I can mark the exact point I'm measuring against. And I should be able to do that with my suspension fully extended and with me sat on the bike. So that's great. Right, let's get on and do that. Okay, I'm lifting the bike all the way up, and I can see, because I've put some markers on my piece of wood, that I've got static sag of about 20 millimeters. Right, I've got my big heavy jacket on with all of its liners in, and I've got my helmet hanging off the bike as well, so I'm pretty representative of the sort of weight that I would be when I'm sitting on the bike. Now, it's not a question of just sitting on top of it and taking the measurement. What I now need to do is give it a bit of a bounce, and this is because of a thing called stiction. And stiction is a portmanteau of static and friction. So inside the suspension there's all kinds of static and all kinds of friction, as the name suggests, and so you just need to free up that suspension so that it settles in the position that you would normally be in when you're riding. So now that I've done that, what I need to do is reach over and make another mark onto my piece of wood. So now I've got an upper and lower mark on my piece of wood, and I should be able to see exactly what my sag level is. Then I'm going to make the relevant adjustments, and then I am going to get it checked by somebody with a tape measure, not me with a piece of wood. But that's certainly a good start, isn't it? Okay, this might be a bit Heath Robinson and all that, but I think it's done the job. And what I can see is from the suspension fully extended, which is that top mark, I've then got the static sag, which takes me about 20 mil down, and then I get on the bike and it drops another 30 mil. So I've got about 50 mil altogether of sag. Now, I think that's a little bit too much, and what I want to do is get that down to about 30, so I'm clearly going to have to add some preload to that spring, much as I suspected. Now then, I talked about a few challenges with doing this bike, and that is going to be the next one, because that spring is going to be quite difficult to move. So let's get on and have a go. Right, so on the Z900, this set of rings at the back is set really quite a long way back. In fact, it's right at the back of the thread. It's as far back as it could be, in fact. So I need to get that wound forwards to give the spring some compression and therefore add rebound. And there are two rings at the end. One's a locking nut and one is the one that you use to adjust it. So I bought myself this set of spanners, £18.50 from eBay, and there's all sorts of measurements on them. So I've got a CR32, an ER40, ER32, an APU16, an ER25 and an AP13. Those five don't fit, but this one luckily does. So you could probably just get away with buying a C32. I don't know if that's the right spanner for the job. I think it might even be a little bit too small. Okay, I hope you can see into there, and I've got to hurry up because it started raining now. But what I managed to do was to crack off that locking nut, and I used my C32 spanner. I managed to get it on top of there, and it just cracked it off just enough so that I could get myself a piece of wood in there and then just tap out that locking ring, and then completely undid it, moved it away out of the way. That was straightforward enough. Now this thing is obviously quite useful, but what I struggled with was to actually do up this adjuster ring. It's very difficult to get it on there. I mean, you can do it, and when you find the right position you can do a little bit of adjusting, but I really struggled with that. So the top tips from the internet, some people say you can get your hands onto the spring and you can move the whole thing round. Oh, well, you can just about move the spring if you do that, but I think I'd need some time in the gym. So other top tips I've read is to get yourself a blunt chisel and put it on there. That's not going to happen, I'm not doing that. And the same goes, you can do it with a blunt screwdriver. Now you can actually move it quite well with a screwdriver by tapping the ring round like that. It does work, but you know, that's a piece of hard metal and that's a piece of soft aluminium, so I don't think that's a very good idea. So what I settled on was some pieces of wood, and I found these in my shed, just some pieces of oak, and I put those on there. I'm doing this left-handed now so you can see with the camera, but I managed to tap the ring round with those. So that for me was the best solution that I came up with, and I'll try and show you how well that works now. So I'll show you how I did this. I didn't lean over the bike to do it, I was kneeling next to it, but for the purposes of filming, that goes on there, and then I can tap the ring round nice and easily with that. And that I found was the best method. Now what I can't say is how many turns of that I've done, but what I can say is I can now see about 12 millimeters of thread. A lot of it actually is quite rusty as well, so if I did have one top tip, it would be to grease the thread that you're about to turn that onto, so that you don't get that rusting appear in the future underneath the adjustment ring. So anyway, I've done that. What is a best guess at where it should be, and I've done some testing and adjusting, so I think it's in the right place. And let's have a look and go back to my measuring stick. And with me on the bike, wearing my helmet, I am now down to about 25, well that's about 30 mil sag I've got on there, from what looks to me. Yeah, I think that's about 30 mil. Okay, so whilst the rain was coming down, I wheeled the bike into the garage and I've cleared up this back end. So I've got the locking ring and I put it back on and put it up snug against the adjustment ring, so those two are nice and tight together. I did that firstly with the CR32 hook wrench, so I got that on and just tightened it up, and then I tapped it in place again with a piece of wood and a hammer. So all done. I rechecked the amount of sag with me sat on it with a proper tape measure, with my wife giving me a hand, and actually that was bang on as well. So sag done. That's in a good place. Let's have a look at the bike then and see how it looks compared to how it did before. Now you'll remember the back end was really soft and squishy before, so let's see what we've got now. Oh, and that is very nice. And I can feel the rebound is really strong. You can see the back wheel kicking out just from just from that rebound. But the amount I can push down, it feels much more solid. That's going to be a far more engaging ride, and I think that's really going to help the back end of that bike. Proof of the pudding is going to be when I ride it, but so far, so good. That's really nice, but definitely need to adjust that rebound now. Anyway, the tools I ended up using then, firstly was mainly this C32 hook wrench. I don't know if it is the right size, but it was just about right to fit onto that locking ring and crack it off. And from there, I pretty much used a hammer and a piece of wood. So piece of wood as my suspension adjuster and a piece of wood as my measuring device for checking sag. So your move, Alan Milliard. Right, next up then, let's get on and see what we can do with that rebound. But so far, this is looking really good. Right, before I set to work with my screwdriver, I just want to explain rebound and dampening, as much for my own sanity as much as for you guys. So there's a screw that you can turn, and if you screw it all the way clockwise, it effectively puts a needle into a hole, and that stops the flow of liquid, generally fork oil, from moving around inside the suspension, which gives you a dampening effect. So it dampens the effect of the spring bouncing like this. And on this bike, I can only really impact on the rebound, so the spring will compress at whatever rate it does, and then depending on where I place that screw will depend on how quickly it will rebound back out. So it may spring like this, or I can make it spring like that. Now then, I went out and rode this bike twice down that bumpy piece of road that I used to test the front suspension, and I filmed it twice. And on the first time, which you'll see on the left hand side of the screen as you look at it, the screw for the dampening was turned all the way to the right, so maximum dampening, very little rebound, and it felt dead. I mean, there was no real kind of rebound at all. Then I filmed it again, which you'll see on the right hand side of the screen, and that's with the screw all the way anti-clockwise, and for that meant that the back end was bouncing around like Zebedee as I was riding down the road. Now I think either of those extremes is bad. If you've got too much dampening, so not enough rebound, what can happen is the spring compresses as you go over bumps until it eventually bottoms out. That's clearly not good. It also makes for a very hard and uncomfortable ride. Might be okay for a track day, probably not for riding around the Cotswolds. Now if you turn it all the way left, so you've got minimum dampening, maximum rebound, it's too springy and you bounce along the road and it feels really unsafe and horrible. So whereabouts do we do it? Right, if I give this a push down, that feels so much better than it did before, but that aside, it seems to be coming back up to a point and it doesn't have any kind of after bumps afterwards. So actually I don't think that's far off. Yeah, I don't think, well, I don't know if I'm going to really change that right now, but I think I've set it in about the right position, which is a turn and a half from clockwise. So let's go out and have a ride. I'm going to take my screwdriver with me and then we'll do some adjustments and see what's what. So what have I learned from all this then? Well, as far as sag and setting the preload goes, it's definitely something to check, and you can do that fairly easily in the comfort of your own garage or on your driveway. Now the front for me didn't make that much difference, but then again I didn't really change it that much. But the rear adjustments made a huge difference and the most significant change that I made overall. Although ironically that's the bit that you're not supposed to do yourself. Well, that's according to the manual anyway. I personally would recommend giving it a go. Now as for rebound, well, there's no substitute for getting out on the road and doing some sort of test and adjust. You can always do your best on the driveway, but for me, that's simply not representative of hammering through the countryside or however you ride. So best to get out there, make a couple of stops, and just keep notching up the rebound one click at a time until you hit the sweet spot. But that's about it for this week. I've got Motorcycle Live coming up near the end of November, and that's the thing I really look forward to all year round. I'll probably do a couple of short videos from there and see if I can work out what my next bike's going to be. But until then, keep your chains oiled, and I'll see you soon. I thought we'd bottomed out then, but I've still got the stand down. I think I may have just done it.